We know that the Dance of the Dragons was a fiery and bloody business, but it was just so violent and terrible that it almost left the House Targaryen extinct. In fact, the same goes for House Velaryon, which had to depend on a legitimized bastard to keep its name going. What started as a family feud between two scions of King Viserys ensured the deaths of almost all dragons and many of the great lords and knights who participated in it, leaving only a few who survived the dance. And even they died shortly after the Civil War ended. But who exactly survived the Dance of Dragons in the books? And will these people also survive in the TV series? Well, that's what we're here to find out. So without further ado, let's begin, shall we?
Rather to the throne room, Your Grace.
Dowager Queen Alicent Hightower. So Alicent Hightower did survive the Dance of the Dragons, but I believe she wished she had perished with the rest of her family. I mean, at the end, what did she have left? Her father Otto, her brother Gwaine, all of her children, and all but one of her grandchildren had died in the Civil War. After the dance, she was left to ask herself whether all that hunger for power and legacy was worth the losses she suffered, if it was worth the deaths that happened in the family and across the realm. And needless to say, she did not like the answers to these questions. The war had begun after King Viserys I died, and Alicent moved the pieces as soon as she could to ensure that Rhaenyra's coronation did not happen in King's Landing, despite knowing full well in the book that Rhaenyra was the late king's one true heir. It almost looked like she'd always been ready with her plan and had been waiting for the night the king died. Alicent and Sir Criston Cole helped gather the small council, and although there was some dissent, the small council decided Aegon III would ascend the throne. The show version had given her more nuance, of course, because House of the Dragons at least had her argue that Rhaenyra should be spared, since the two had once been friends. Fire and Blood's Alicent, however, was far more sinister. But after the dance was done and Aegon III, or Aegon the Younger, had been crowned, Alicent's head was not put on a spike. It seemed like, although she herself had no mercy for those who stood against her son, her enemies showed mercy to her again and again. If others had treated her the way she would have treated them, she would have died much earlier. After Aegon II was murdered, the Velaryons arrested Alicent. But Cregan Stark, the hand of Aegon III, freed Alicent. But that did not mean she could roam the grounds of the Red Keep freely. There was a high chance that she could kill Aegon at the first chance, or hurl curses at him. In fact, she even asked her granddaughter and wife to Aegon III that she should slit the king's throat in his sleep. But they still did not want to execute her out of sympathy and the fear of rekindling the war. So Sir Tyland Lannister, the hand of the king, sentenced her to remain in Maegard's Holdfast as a prisoner. For the last year of her life, Alicent never left her chambers. Only her septa, guards, and servant girls stayed near her. In her final days, the Dowager Queen began talking to herself, cried often, and even came to hate the color green. And before the winter fever took her, she wished to see her sons again, along with Helaena, her daughter. And curiously enough, she also wanted to see King Jaehaerys, but not her husband King Viserys. The Dowager Queen Alicent Hightower died in 133 AC. Lord Cregan Stark. Cregan Stark, Lord of Winterfell, initially sent his 2,000 winter wolves, and he himself joined the battle very late. But when he did and rode south, he ensured that everyone understood how the North was not to be trifled with. He taught everyone how and why the Northerners had a scary reputation. I agree that by the time Lord Stark came down south, the war had already devoured most of the dragons, kings, heirs, and proud houses. But Cregan brought with him the good old Northern sense of justice, and this made the Greens fearful. So much so that they murdered their own king. But Cregan's own life had not exactly been peaceful before the dance either. You see, he was only 13 when his father, Lord Rickon Stark, died. Winterfell then came under the regency of Rickon's younger brother, Bernard Stark, who did not want to give up power once Cregan came of age. So in 126 AC, Cregan took back his ancestral seat by imprisoning Uncle Bernard and his 3 cousins, which tells us that the young lord was not a boy who would rather act when asking nicely would not yield results. And people knew about Lord Stark and the kind of man he was all across Westeros. When the Civil War raised its ugly head from the Red Keep, Cregan remembered the promise that his ancestor made to King Viserys and honored that promise by declaring for the Blacks, and he sent the first host of Northmen under Lord Roderick Dustin of Barrowtown. These men, the Winter Wolves, fought in the Riverlands. Although they later lost the First Battle of Tumbleton, Cregan himself marched south with a second host to fight for his queen and to avenge Jaehaera's. But when Lord Stark Stark reached the Red Keep, he was shocked to find that Aegon II had been poisoned by his own supporters, and Boros Baratheon had lost to the Rivermen at the Battle of the King's Road. After this, he became hand to the young Aegon III, and began the Hour of the Wolf. He punished those he thought were guilty of dishonor and betrayal, including the men responsible for King Aegon II's death, with Lord Larys Strong among them. Some may call his actions too severe, but I understand why he did what he did. See, the realm had bled enough because clever men kept playing clever games, and Cregan simply cut that nonsense short, and once his job was done, he did something the Westerosi hardly do. He gave up power and left within a fortnight to return to Winterfell. And yeah, the Stark we see in Game of Thrones are direct descendants of Cregan Stark and his distant cousin and third wife, Rhaena Stark. King Aegon III. Aegon III did survive, but much like Alicent, he lost every member of his family with one exception. For Aegon, it was his brother Viserys, and for Alicent, it was her granddaughter Jaehaera. And of course, this was not Aegon II, the king from the green side. This was Aegon the Younger, the son of Rhaenyra Targaryen and Daemon. And as the war came to its close, this poor child became one of the most tragic figures left in Westerosi history. I mean, imagine being born into the royal family of dragon lords, only to watch that family tear itself apart using dragons. And if that's not enough, imagine seeing your mother devoured by a dragon. In House of the Dragon Season 2, Aegon had been sent to the Vale with Rhaena before he was meant to go to Pentos for safety. In the Fire and Blood novel, Rhaenyra and Daemon's sons, Aegon and Viserys, were shipped away to Pentos until the Blacks could secure King's Landing. They traveled on the Pentoshi Cog along the Gay Abandon, but then the ship met the Triarchy in the Gullet. Aegon escaped on his dragon, Stormcloud, while Viserys, who only had a dragon egg, was taken captive. Aegon did not take part in the war, but he saw the storming of the Dragon Pit from the top of Maegor's Holdfast, and after that, his life only became worse. He eventually fell into the hands of his half-uncle, King Aegon II, who forced the boy to watch as Rhaenyra was fed to Sunfire. That haunted Aegon the Younger for the rest of his life, so much so that the young boy started to fear and despise dragons. Aegon II later returned to King's Landing, but he was poisoned by his own side, and because Aegon II had kept our young boy alive as a hostage against Sir Alfred Broom's advice, the boy survived and inherited the throne in 131 AC. Rhaenyra's loyalists, especially Cregan Stark, placed him on the Iron Throne, and he was married to Jaehaera, Aegon II's daughter, to unite the Greens and the Blacks. In the end, Aegon died at the age of 36 and was known as Aegon the Dragonsbane because it was during his reign that the last Targaryen dragon died. King Viserys II. Please note, this was Viserys, the younger son of Rhaenyra Targaryen and Daemon, and the brother of Aegon the Younger. So anyway, during the war, both boys had been sent away for safety. As I mentioned earlier, their cog, Gay Abandon, was intercepted by the Triarchy fleet. Both kids survived the encounter in the Gullet, but Prince Viserys did not return home with his brother Aegon. He was taken captive by a Tyrashi captain and brought before Sharako Lohar, the admiral of the Triarchy. From here on, the first Magister of Lys, Bambaro Bazan, took charge of it. Like, he was basically sold by Lohar to Bazan. And when Bazan died in debt, Viserys passed into the care of House Rogaire, a wealthy family from Lys. But instead of being subjected to horrors, he was eventually married to Lara Rogaire, the youngest daughter of the powerful banker who had become his host. Fortunately for the realm, in 134 AC, Alyn Velaryon learned where Viserys was and brought him back to Westeros. Needless to say, we cannot begin to imagine what that must have meant for Aegon III. This poor king, who had already lived through his father's death, saw his mother being killed, had to abandon his little brother, was finally reunited with his last remaining family member. He had always blamed himself for leaving Viserys behind, so when Viserys came back alive, it gave him real joy. In fact, Viserys became the only person Aegon truly trusted at court, and later, once both brothers were old enough to rule properly, Viserys became Aegon's right hand and eventually his hand of the king. Aegon brought some stability to the realm, but Viserys handled much of the actual work. Then, after Aegon and his sons died, the crown passed to Viserys and his descendants, which later led to the modern Targaryen line, including Daenerys and Jon Snow. And it's said that had Viserys' reign not been cut short by a sudden illness, he would have become the next conciliator after the old king. Lord Alyn Velaryon. So Alyn Velaryon survived the Dance of the Dragons, and unlike many others in that war, he made an undying legacy for himself. In the House of the Dragon Season 2, Alan of Hull seemed to have no real interest in becoming Corlys Velaryon's son or heir, and the same continued in Season 3's premiere. But history had other plans for him, and we know this from the Fire and Blood novel. During the war, Rhaenyra legitimized him, and the new rulers like Aegon III and Viserys III and their successors honored that. Unlike his brother Adam, Alyn Alyn never rode a dragon, although he tried to get one and failed. But see, Alyn was never fire and blood. He had always been salt and sea, and he proved himself through salt and sea. He became an expert sailor, a strong naval leader, and a worthy successor to Corlys' legacy. After the dance ended, he helped to reclaim Dragonstone from the traitors who had turned against Rhaenyra, but then Corlys died a year later and he became regent, after the Driftwood throne passed to Alyn. He later married Baela Targaryen, who was earlier betrothed to Prince Jaehaera, and Alyn did so partly to save her from a marriage that she was being forced into. Alyn later gained fame as a sailor and warrior, served in the Seven Kingdoms with distinction, and earned the name Oakenfist. But his greatest act was, of course, finding the lost Prince Viserys Targaryen and reuniting him with King Aegon III. Alyn lived for decades after the dance and later died at sea under unknown circumstances. Queen Jaehaera Targaryen. As I mentioned earlier, Princess Jaehaera Targaryen was only the second member from Team Green who survived the Targaryen Civil War, the other one being Dowager Queen Alicent herself. She was the daughter of King Aegon II and Queen Rhaena Targaryen, and in the House of the Dragon Season 2, she narrowly survived the Blood and Cheese assassination, which was an incident terrible enough to scar any child for their entire life, maybe even their afterlife, I think. But young Jaehaera's life had even more misery waiting for her, and for no fault of her own. Like, the only crime she ever committed was being the last living heir of Aegon II, which basically made her politically useful, as if she were a tool or a pawn to be used as per the will of adult men. After Aegon II was murdered, Aegon III took the Iron Throne, and Jaehaera became queen through marriage to him. She was only 8 at the time, so needless to say, the marriage was never consummated. The whole idea was to unite the Greens and the Blacks after the war. And if you think about it, all the lords and knights of King's Landing and beyond somehow had the bright idea that 2 super traumatized, scared, scarred children could somehow repair what adults had burned down with their dragons and their ego. And the saddest part of it all is that Jaehaera didn't even have the proper protection from the one person who should have stood like a shield for her. Alicent, her grandmother, had been lost in her own grief, and as I mentioned earlier at one point, she even suggested that Jaehaera slit Aegon's throat. 2 years later, when Jaehaera was only 10, she allegedly threw herself from a window of Maegor's Holdfast and fell onto the spikes in the moat below, and the poor girl suffered for half an hour before she died. However, many believe this was not suicide at all, and that the Hand of the King, Unwin Peake, had arranged her death so his own daughter could marry Aegon III. We don't know the truth of it, but we do know that Baela and Rhaena Targaryen denied Unwin Peake that prize, and thankfully so. Jaehaera's death once and for all ended the bloodline of Viserys I and Alicent Hightower, while Aegon III later married Rhaena Velaryon and had many children. Speaking of Rhaena and Baela, why don't we talk about them next? Lady Rhaena Targaryen. I think Lady Rhaena Targaryen is the one who not only survived the Dance of the Dragons, but also came out of it with the 2 things that the Westeros of that time needed the most desperately, especially after all that fire and blood. The first of these was hope, and the second was a newborn dragon called Mourning. Much like the other kids who became victims of the dance, Lady Rhaena also lost much of her family, but compared to many others, Rhaena still had her sister Baela, her younger half-brother Aegon III, and most importantly, a dragon. During the war, Rhaena spent most of her time away from Dragonstone and King's Landing, which was probably the best thing that could have happened to her. She and her half-brother Prince Joffrey had been sent to the Vale of Arryn, and while Joffrey had Tyraxis, Rhaena had 3 dragon eggs. One of those eggs hatched into Mourning, the first dragon born since the dance began. And although the dragons would ultimately cease to exist not long after, at least at that point, Mourning's hatching seemed like a bit of proof that House Targaryen had not completely burned its own future. At the end of the war, Rhaena sailed from Gulltown to King's Landing with Lady Jane Arryn, and Mourning soon became a wonder to the people there. Rhaena and Baela also helped shield Aegon III from the schemes of his regents, especially the Hand, Lord Unwin Peake. Later, Rhaena married Corwin Corbray of the Vale, whom she had grown close to during her time there. A few years later, Rhaena rode Mourning for the first time, which made her the only known dragon rider in the world except for Nettles. Since the show has merged Rhaena and Nettles, Rhaena would likely have the honor of being the last dragon rider alive in the show as well. But there's also a very strong possibility that Queen Rhaenyra would see Rhaena responsible for the death of Prince Jace, and would want Rhaena's head for it. Maybe Daemon would come to Rhaena's defense and the royal couple would have a falling out, after which Daemon and Rhaena would head to Harrenhal or Maidenpool on Caraxes and Sheepstealer to confront Aemond and Vhagar, where all 6 would perish. But yeah, let's see what happens. Lady Baela Targaryen. Unlike Lady Rhaena, her sister Baela's life was not as happy and gay after the Dance of the Dragons. She was the daughter of Prince Daemon and Rhaena Velaryon, and in House of the Dragon, she lived on Dragonstone with Queen Rhaenyra and Daemon. She had also been promised to Jaehaera Targaryen, Rhaenyra's heir, so her place among the Blacks was pretty high, at least until Jace was still alive. Now, Baela had always been seen as the fiercer of Daemon's daughters, and it showed even in the show. She was a great help to Queen Rhaenyra on a number of occasions, and during the Battle of the Gullet, she was clearly the better dragon rider than Prince Jace. Baela rode Moondancer during the dance, but yeah, in the book, she did not take part in much of the war as such in the beginning. After the Blacks captured King's Landing, she divided her time between Dragonstone and Driftmark, but after the fall of Dragonstone in 130 AC, Baela finally joined the fight properly, and her battle with Aegon II and Sunfire became the moment that defined her. She and Moondancer fought Sunfire, and while that clash badly hurt Aegon's dragon, it cost Baela her own. Moondancer died, and Baela was taken prisoner by the Greens. Later, after Sunfire died from those wounds, Aegon II wanted Baela brought out for execution, but because she was Lord Corlys Velaryon's granddaughter, Aegon's maester advised another path, and following the same, Aegon instead called Alyn Velaryon from Driftmark to swear fealty. Then, when Aegon II was poisoned, Baela was spirited away on Lord Lyrys Strong's orders. After Aegon III became king, Baela and Rhaena helped convince him to free Corlys from custody. Baela would then go on to marry Alyn, which made her the Lady of Driftmark. Alys Rivers. The last update we had about Alys Rivers was that she became the Queen Witch of Harrenhal, and that's it. The novel revealed little to nothing else after that. I mean, what were we supposed to do with that information? Anyway, it's always been clear that Alys was never a regular character. In the show, she helped Daemon face his inner demons at Harrenhal, and basically helped him get free access to all the episodes of Game of Thrones Season 7 and 8. But the thing is, in the novel, she had a much larger role to play, and most of it was with Aemon instead of Daemon. So after the battle above God's Eye, where Aemon, Daemon, and their dragons perished, Alys retreated to Harrenhal and claimed she was now carrying the child of Aemon Targaryen, mind you. She said child, not bastard. And yeah, we do know that she went with him after Aemon had previously come to Harrenhal, so she could very well have been speaking the truth. And seeing Aemon's mommy issues and his love for older women, I want to believe Alys's words. Anyway, not only that, she also said the boy was the true heir to the Iron Throne, instead of Aegon III. In the end, Sir Tyland Lannister, who served as the Hand of the King, sent Sir Regis Groves of the Kingsguard and Sir Daemon Darry with 100 men to take Harrenhal back. Alys presented herself as Aemon's widow and placed a young boy before them as their trueborn son. Then Regis made the mistake of insulting the Witch Queen and paid for it with his life, like he just died suddenly. Some said she used magic and burst his skull, while others blamed crossbowmen or slingers. Either way, the Loyalist force fell apart, and Daemon escaped back to Castle Darry with only 32 survivors. The next day, Alys sent a captive as a messenger. He said other prisoners had been tortured to death and that Alys had cursed him so he would die if anyone laughed at his tale. Of course, someone laughed, and the man actually choked to death moments later. Some even said that they saw the marks of a woman's fingers on his throat. The regents later planned a stronger attack, but the winter fever of 133 AC stopped them, and after that, Alys's fate remained unknown. But seeing that Alys had been helping Daemon and the Black Cause, and the fact that she is helping him prepare his house for the long night, I doubt that Alys Rivers will take the same course in the TV series that she did in the book. But there's only one way to find out. Lord Corlys Velaryon. I think with the exception of Tyland Lannister, every other great lord and powerful person died during the dance or at the hands of Cregan Stark. But then again, one must remember that this was Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, the man who had traveled the furthest quarters of the world and lived to tell the tale, and also the man whose fleet had been one of Rhaenyra's strongest strengths. But by the end of the war, Corlys had paid a terrible price. He lost his wife Rhaenyra at Rook's Rest, along with Meleys. He also lost his legal grandsons one after another. Lucerys died at Shipbreaker Bay, Jaehaera died at the Battle of the Gullet, and Joffrey died during the storming of the Dragon Pit. So, although Corlys survived, he was basically left without an heir for a very long time. He and Rhaenyra had a falling out about the loyalty of Addam Velaryon. You see, the two betrayers, Ulf White and Hugh Hammer, had done their thing, and Rhaenyra became paranoid. She started doubting that the other two dragon seeds, Nettles and Addam, would also betray her, and wanted their heads. But Corlys saw Addam as his heir and could not just throw away another one of his heirs to the war. So he helped her escape, and Rhaenyra saw that as a betrayal, and he found himself in the dungeons as a result. After Rhaenyra fled from King's Landing, the Greens, under Alicent, offered Corlys a pardon, but he accepted mercy only on the condition for pardons for those who had fought on the black side, and also for Baela's release, and for a marriage between Aegon the Younger and Jaehaera, so the green and black lines could be united once and for all. Later, after Aegon II was poisoned, Corlys was arrested with the other alleged conspirators when Cregan Stark took control of the Red Keep, but Lady Alysanne Blackwood asked for his pardon in exchange for her hand in marriage to Lord Cregan Stark, and Cregan listened to her. After that, Corlys became one of Aegon III's regents. He served ably and was seen as the most powerful among them, but he was already an old man after a very long life. 1 year later, he died of natural causes. Sir Tyland Lannister. So, Sir Tyland Lannister was the same man who had argued that Aegon the Younger should be executed after Aegon II suggested that the young prince should be sent to the wall or gelded, because Tyland believed, and rightly so, that as long as Rhaenyra's son lived, he would remain a threat. Later, Tyland had been sent across the Narrow Sea with Sir Marston Waters and Sir Julian Wormwood to find sellswords in Pentos, Tyrashi, and Myr. While he was away in Myr, Aegon II was murdered, and Aegon III took the throne. Lady Jaehaera Lannister then arranged Tyland's pardon by returning Casterly Rock's share of the crown's gold. Soon after, Tyland returned to King's Landing and became Hand of the King at the start of Aegon III's regency. But during the course of his journey, Tyland's face had been severely disfigured, so he wore a silken hood at court because ladies new to the capital were known to faint at the sight of him, and because of all this, he was now called the Hooded Hand. But beneath that hood, Tyland proved far more capable than many expected him to be. You see, despite his earlier requests of having Aegon killed, he served the new king well and loyally, and went so far as to say he could no longer remember who had backed the Blacks or the Greens. And I guess that's one of the most honest things someone has ever said about the Dance of Dragons. Next thing we know, he started working his ass off towards restoring the realm. He restored trade, removed the taxes Rhaenyra and Bartimos Celtigar had imposed, gave loans for ruined holdings, built huge granaries full of grain, repaired the dragon pit, strengthened the city gates, and funded new ward galleys. He also kept the realm out of the Free Cities conflicts in the Stepstones. Even with Grand Maester Orwell, he delayed the execution and gave the old man a comfortable cell, likely out of old friendship and shared suffering. He died in 133 AC with Septon Eustace present and King Aegon III holding his hand. For a man who had once wanted the boy dead, his end speaks volumes for who he had transformed into. So these were the 11 main characters from House of the Dragons TV show who are most likely to survive the dance. But as a special mention, I'd like to name Nettles, the girl who was forced to flee because of a paranoid queen. That's all in this one, guys. If you liked the video, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more awesome videos like this. Stay safe, and as always, stay marvelous.